We've got the opportunity to take $300 a tonne grain and turn it into $700-800 a tonne if we export it as red meat.
The world expects us to change, and it's not always easy to do.
It's really safe for the animal, it's safe for the business, but it's safe for the environment.
The shit that comes out of the feedlots that goes on to the paddocks still contains these ionophores.
If I didn't get production performance for customers, I didn't have a job.
And at the end of the day, if you didn't have to use antibiotics, why would you? Rob, we've talked about how to make money out of grass, and we've started to talk about how to make money out of animals. But one of the areas that is often neglected is how do you make money out of grain? You've got a couple of choices when you grow grain. You can either sell it to the market or you can sell it to the feedlot. Can you just unpack that for me as to what that actually means?
Yeah, I think if we look at our industry in that mixed farming sector, so that typical sheep wheat belt from northern New South Wales down through into Victoria, across to South Australia, then over into Western Australia. We've got these businesses that have a combination of cropping and then also livestock enterprises. And we work really hard and we spend a lot of money on inputs in the cropping space. And then we effectively can sometimes give grain away where, historically grain prices haven't moved a lot. In the last 25, 30 years I've been in the industry, we're still getting the same sort of dollar for grain per tonne as we were back then. And the opportunity now with livestock and protein production becoming so much more profitable and the pricing changing so much that, I only think 6-7 years ago, $3.50, $4 a kilo for lamb at a hook rate was where the market was at. Today we're seeing numbers around $12. It's a really different dynamic now. So taking internally produced cereal grains, particularly, and exporting them in a B double as a stock crate rather than through a tipper, has a real value add. So if we're talking about grain that's typically $300 a tonne about the current market, and we compare that to where the lamb job is particularly, or even the cattle job, we've got the opportunity to take $300 a tonne grain and turn it into $700-800 a tonne if we export it as red meat. So the opportunity to value add internally is really high, and it gets back to just following the rules to execute it. But to take those grains that we produce on farm and export it through an animal is hugely profitable way to generate income for your business.
Interesting. Having done the maths, the more feed efficient you become with that animal, the higher the value of that grain.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about kilos in to kilos out. So if we use less kilos of grain to produce more kilos of live weight, it's a bigger multiplier.
Yeah, and look, it sounds intuitive. We've actually got the maths on the website for all those who want to check that out. But the more efficient you become, the more profitable your grain enterprise becomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really about taking those commodities you produce and selling them to the highest bidder. Now, internally in that business, if the highest bidder that gives you the return is the livestock enterprise, you're better off selling it to yourself and turning it into red meat than putting it through the board and delivering it to the silo in town where you're going to cop a commodity price of cereal grains where everyone's producing, and the returns are quite low now in that space.
So not all grains are grains, right? So when we're starting to talk about choosing the right grain for the animal, what do you mean by that?
So there's a couple of parts to that. Is when we start to think about fermentation, the bugs rely on starch. So starch are the drivers of fermentation. Now, we've basically got four kings in that starch space. Corn, wheat, barley and triticale are our four kings that we need to deal with when we start to talk about feeding livestock. They provide the most amount of starch. Barley's typically somewhere around 60% starch. So what we need to remember, though, is that cheap grain is cheap for a reason. So if it's been discounted, it's weather damaged. If the high protein grain's starting to come in, we're actually losing starch volumes. So protein and starch are inversely related. So as protein goes up, total starch volumes go down. So when I'm starting to look to put the diet together, we're effectively looking for the same grain quality that a maltster's looking for. So we're looking for high test weight, gives us an indication of size, and low protein gives us the indication of how much starch is in there relative to the protein. So, a malt barley is exactly what we're after. So sometimes if we look at cheap grains in the system, we're starting to look at F3 in that barley space, particularly high screenings, high protein, low test weight. We're really paying a cheap price for a commodity, but it becomes the dearest to feed.
Yeah. So it's not always about the price of the input, it's about the return on the investment of that input.
Absolutely. It's about making sure we've got the quality of the nutrition going into the animal to flip that as quick as possible into a saleable product.
Yeah, okay. So there's some componentry to this. There's the starch, there's the protein, and there's also the premixes, the things that actually you've got to add in there as part of any feedlot diet. Do you want to just walk through the intricacies of that?
Yeah, so whilst we drive fermentation with high quality and high volumes of starch in these diets, we actually start to run a risk where we skew fermentation patterns in these animals that they produce a lot of lactic acid. So when we add starches, these bugs ferment, and that fermentation actually drives high levels of volatile fatty acids. So things like propionate, acetate, and butyrate as our key energy sources, but it also generates lactic acid. Now, managing that lactic acid production is one thing, but also managing the lactic acid that is produced is another component to that. So premix design is about getting an environment that these bacteria can sit in there and digest those starches and skew their production to the volatile fatty acids we want and skew it away from the lactic acid we don't want.
So which volatile fatty acid are we chasing here?
So when we start to produce really high quality fermentation, the most predominant fatty acid we're chasing is propionate, because propionate is the shortest pathway to glucose. So it gets produced in the rumen, basically absorbed through the rumen wall, through the little papillae, into the bloodstream, and really quickly gets converted to glucose. That glucose is then metabolized and used as an energy source. Now, if we can get more propionate being produced, those animals become more efficient. We also then need to think about, well, if we've got some lactic acid being produced, what can we do to absorb that lactic acid? Because it's the simple chemistry, lactic acid changes the ruminal pH. So ruminal pH is the environment that the bugs sit in. We go and feed a grain diet. Our typical pH sits in about that 6.2, 6.3. That's the real comfort zone for these bacteria to process that grain and turn it into the volatile fatty acids.
But when you put lactic acid in there and it grows at the speed it can grow as a result of the different types of bugs you've got in, and we call it acidosis, how does that pH change and how quickly does it change?
Yeah, so you can change pH really fast. So a couple of hours we can go from a stable 6.3 to a clinical acidotic event of sub 5.5 really quickly. And this is, I guess, the point I'm trying to make is pH measures hydrogen ions. It's basic chemistry. Hydrogen has a positive charge. We need to get some compounds in there that act like big sponges and soak them up before it impacts the animal. So we use different formulations in our premixes to give us the chemistry relationships where it gives us a really strong negative charge, so big charge sites, that allow those positive hydrogen ions to stick to them and become less harmful to the animal because they're not freely available to be absorbed into the rumen wall and into the bloodstream, which is then when we start to see the clinical acidosis signs. So really focusing on the quality of premix, one, to create the environment for fermentation that the bugs are happy to thrive and survive in, but then secondly, be aware that we are going to have some level of lactic acid being produced, and then our job is to actually manage that lactic acid that's produced. So think about the chemistry that's going on in there. We're producing a heap of hydrogen ions. We need to add something in there to buffer it out, and they're called buffers.
Yeah,
so,
right.
you know, traditionally there's been things like ionophores, which are pretty broad spectrum antibiotics, which are used to, I guess, change the bacterial colonies, the populations that are in there. We're focused away from changing the bacterial colonies in terms of using antibiotics, because the antibiotics also kill the good bacteria that produce the volatile fatty acids we're after. So what we've looked at is how do we get chemistry better? How do we get the interactions of the hydrogen and the sink sites to actually get that capture and absorption so it negates the impact of lactic acid?
One of the interesting things about the whole discussion around ionophores, which is what we call them, the rest of the world knows them as antibiotics, right, is that the industry's been feeding antibiotics for feedlotting for basically the last 50 years. And one of the most striking statistic I've come across is that between 70 and 80% of all antibiotics produced in this world actually go into animal husbandry, and the majority of those into feedlots. And the world expects us to change. And it's not always easy to do. You're going to blow the economics of this up if you don't mitigate acidosis, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we always talk about risk, and these compounds have been really successful at mitigating risk. Risk to the animal, risk to the business. They're the two risks that it's really focused on. What I guess we've challenged ourselves to do is reimagine the challenge we're faced. You know, these antibiotic compounds were first used to manage coccidiosis in goats. That was their first registration.
And they work, right?
Yeah, they work. There's no doubt about that. But what they've actually done, I guess, through the evolution of time is our understanding of biology, the utilisation of genetic tools to understand who's in the zoo in terms of the microbial population, and then using tools to manage and manipulate fermentation patterns. We've gotten a hell of a lot better at it. And the compounds we can use now that don't need to rely on antibiotics, that allow us to manipulate fermentation rates in a way that is really safe for the animal, it's safe for the business, but it's safe for the environment. And the thing about these compounds is they're actually an environmental pollutant. You know,
How so? What do you mean by that?
Most of them pass through the animal unchanged. So we've got, you know, manure coming out of feedlots being spread. It's particularly changing the soil microbiome because they are still actively...
Just run that past me again. So the shit that comes out of the feedlots that goes onto the paddocks still contains these ionophores. They go into the soil, and of course they're an antimicrobial, so they're going to dampen down the activity of the microbiome in the soil.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. There's a whole body of work coming out of the US at the moment showing that we change carbon sequestration because the antibiotics are capping microbial activity in the soils. So
yeah, right.
These things fall into watercourses. They're a pollutant that they can precipitate. The linkages are, there's positive and negative science showing the linkage between resistance in the human health sector, and there's also the challenges we face because we're exposed to it so often in our environment. So we need to be able to get the tools back from a human health sector and give us our antibiotics that work, and we don't need to precipitate resistance because resistance is actually generated by genes. It's about the exposure to certain compounds that get genes to express resistance. Now, what we are trying to do is we can feed livestock safely, we can drive production, we can drive performance, but we can do it in a way that allows us to use alternate compounds that aren't antimicrobials.
One of the interesting things about this discussion is we're quickly moving to social license, but our customers and the growth of our business hasn't relied on that social license. I mean, the reality is people are trying to make a living out of feedlotting. So it's really about the economic performance. And the problem we've solved is being able to take these compounds out of these premixes and still deliver the economic performance that the industry needs and demands, and our customers expect.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. For me, the social license is only just a side benefit.
Yeah.
In my past, if I didn't get production performance for customers, I didn't have a job. So production is always front of mind. Animal safety is front of mind. Business security is front of mind.
Absolutely.
If we line those things up and we can do it in a way that gives us social license, look, this is a free kick. So really focusing on the core, that understanding that we have the ability to manage, control and influence what's going on within our farm gate from a profitability perspective is absolutely key. The side benefits, access to markets, those sort of things are really...
Look, you raise a really interesting point. I mean, the social licence is a social licence, but the economic reality probably drives the industry even more for change. 80% of our lambs that we grow and process in Australia go to the United States. Now, these ionophores in the United States are actually considered antibiotics.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a grey area depending on the regulatory framework. In Australia, the peak body, the APVMA, they're in a separate class of their own. They are actually ionophores, so they're not technically defined as an antibiotic. So what happens is we sign a declaration, an NVD, when we sell animals, and that these animals have not been treated with an antibiotic, which is correct. We go to an overseas market where those compounds are seen differently in a regulatory framework, we're at risk. So it's really about a conscious decision we can make to know that, are we willing to run the risk and use these compounds and maybe get caught and found out, or can we be clean, grown and profitable all in the same time? So it's really a case of just being aware that there's some areas, and they're going to change, I think, as the future changes, but it is a different landscape as we go overseas. Now, a really classic example is that with the work I've been doing in the US is 12, 18 months ago, political change took place. The language around social license, carbon, the environment was very strong. 3 weeks ago back in the US, no one cares. So the whim of the political landscape is going to be a really big external factor to our businesses. And we've only got to get a legislative change that could impact us. And if we think particularly about the cattle industry, is the time it takes to turn an animal around from the day it is born to the day it hits the table can be up to a 3 or 4 year process depending on the market.
Yes.
Now, we talk about turning the Titanic. We need to be aware that we can't change as quick as legislation can. So we need to be future-proofing, prepare our systems to go, if things change, we've got opportunity, we've got options. And that's really, I guess, where I'm looking at it from, going, if we can do things without impacting our potential sales pathways, it's got to be good for our business risk and our business security into the future.
But you've also got to prove it. And you've got to have the science behind it to show that what we're delivering mitigates the risk of acidosis, allows for economic performance, and it's done without any antibiotics. I mean, at the end of the day, if you didn't have to use antibiotics, why would you?
Yeah, look, it's been a bit of a personal thing, as you know, my involvement from ProAgni from the start is I love science. I love the deep, dark, gritty stuff. And I've always said, if I'm going to be involved, this needs to be proven and scientifically validated outside our hands. And we've spent a lot of time and money trying to understand modes of action, trying to understand how it works, and actually getting validation of the science. We've got published papers now that show that. We've got good stability of ruminal pH, published data that's available in public areas. It was done by University of New England. We've done work in the US. It's really a case of validating the science around this can be done. This isn't snake oil and muck and mystery. This is about taking really good science and empowering farmers at a really simple level at farm gate.
Well, at the end of the day, our customers need to know that 3 things. Firstly, their animal's going to be safe. Secondly, that they've been fed what we say we're going to feed them. There aren't any contaminants in there, or they don't have antibiotics in the premixes. And thirdly, it delivers an economic performance for them.
Yeah, that's all that matters. And
all that matters.
I think we've got to flip it nearly that the economic performance comes first.
Absolutely.
Because if we're not there, we're not there. Like, it's, into the future, if we don't continue to progress and strive and get better business operations, our security into the future for the next generation is going to be compromised.
All right. So if you didn't have to feed antibiotics, if you didn't have to use antibiotics, why would you?